economic and livelihoods recovery, and governance and political processes. It's important to understand the natural resource context and that different types of resources require different interventions. It's also important to note that often conflict resources are not just a local issue, but they have an international dynamic associated with their trade and exploitation. Natural resources natural resources provide both opportunities and constraints. For instance, in reintegrating former combatants, land provides opportunities for alternative livelihoods, but if you don't have the land, it can be a constraint. Or if you don't have arable land, or you don't have access to it because it's locked up with the current owners. Similarly, water services, if you're trying to kind of provide peace dividends in the Iraqi marshes, and you want to entice the marsh Arabs back to their homelands by improving the quality of life, effective management of water to provide for potable drinking water can be part of that strategy. In order to effectively program for natural resources, you need to know the role of natural resources. What is the current status? What are the opportunities? There was an unfortunate incident in Sudan where development officials went in to try to provide a peace dividend, and they drilled wells everywhere. So the villagers were happy. Peace is good. They did not figure out what the carrying capacity was. And soon the withdrawal exceeded the recharge. The wells went dry. There goes your peace dividend. So it's important to do an assessment at the outset of the status of the natural resources, the capacity, the role of the natural resources in the history, in culture, and the relationship of the different communities to the resource. Who owns it? Who uses it? Is it important to the economy? Attention in Liberia on forests focuses a lot on the commercial side of things. There's also local livelihoods that are provided through community forests and food. A lot of protein comes, for better or for worse, from the bushmeat trade. And the characteristics of the resource itself. Is it lootable? Is it, how valuable is it? Do you need to secure it? We see that not all resources are equal when it comes to peace building. Some are more prominent. There are certain resources that played a role in the onset of the conflict or in financing the conflict. And these become priority resources in the peacebuilding phase. And examples include diamonds in Sierra Leone, land in Nepal, timber in Liberia. Most of the priority resources are high-value resources that were involved in financing. But you will also often see land as a contributing cause of conflict. And if you don't address these resources, either by dealing with access, by dealing with redistribution or benefit sharing, it can undermine the long-term viability of the peace. In some cases, a single resource hits multiple peace-building objectives. And addressing these resources in a coordinated way can improve the overall peace-building activities. And we've termed these flexible resource interventions, where you try to coordinate, say, on timber in Liberia, how the resource factors into the economy, how it factors into livelihoods, how it factors into governance and corruption, how it factors into reintegration programs for soldiers. And then, in some instances, natural resources are very important for specific objectives, but they don't necessarily cut across objectives, or they're not programmed across objectives. And so those are more specialized interventions. And I'd like to close the overview by noting that often the flow of natural resources and the trade of natural resources is transboundary. And so it's not sufficient to only focus on what's happening in that particular locality or that particular country. And with that, I would like to invite David Gutierrez up to speak about counter-narcotics efforts and Afghan poppy farmers.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Carl. As Carl said, my name is Dave Gutierrez, and before I get started talking about the poppies in Afghanistan, I'd like to mention that while I wrote this paper, I was an employee at the Center for Naval Analysis, which is the think tank that services the Navy and the Marine Corps for the most part. I'm currently a federal employee, so my remarks today shouldn't be taken as a representation of the federal government, nor of CNA. So if you have any problems or concerns, I'll be happy to provide you with Allison's phone number, and you can give her a call since she's still at CNA. So a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today is the conflict in Afghanistan. We'll first talk about the background of that just very briefly, talk about why poppies are an important part of that conflict, and then what we have done to address the problem, the lessons learned that we've gotten from the results that we've seen, for better or for worse. So very briefly, as I'm sure everyone is very aware, the conflict in Afghanistan has gone from what we thought would be a very brief military intervention back in 2001 to a full-blown counterinsurgency operation on behalf of the United States and our allies, and NATO in particular. But the conflict there, particularly in regard to poppies, started long before 2001. The country's been in political and societal turmoil since really the 1970s, where there were some civil disruptions going on with regard to the communist government that was in charge, which then led to the occupation of the Soviets during the entirety of the 1980s. When they pulled out, it again left a power vacuum that was filled by the various warlords that were once allies fighting against the Soviets and now broke into their separate factions. Out of that chaos then rose the Taliban movement in the early 1990s, which proceeded to take over the southern portion of the country by 1994, and then took over the capital of Kabul by 1996. And by late in the 1990s, the Taliban controlled about 90% of the landmass within Afghanistan. And as you go along, and we'll see a plot of this in a second, not only was it the conflict building throughout those years, but the production of poppy also continued to grow. And as we'll see, it was at a very low levels in the 1970s, but continued to increase. The more civil disruption there was, the more poppies were grown, until the point where it reached a fever pitch during the 2000s. And why poppies are important here, and you can see a picture of it here, and this I'll just tell you very quickly. So the poppies are grown in the fields, and what you see here on the diagram, the pink, is the latex that comes out. So people come through with lancers, they lance the bulbs of the poppies. This is the opium that comes out, and it dries as a latex, and people come through and they scrape the latex off, and you can store it, and then later turn that into heroin. So this is why people care about the poppy problem in Afghanistan, because it's such a high-value resource. Number one, before I get to this chart, is because it helps to fuel the insurgency that goes on. A lot of the actors within Afghanistan, including the Taliban, but also the criminal elements, the narco-traffickers, and the other international criminal organizations that operate there, benefit in a variety of different ways from the sale and the trafficking of opium inside the country as well as across the borders. So unless we deal with the problem, there's a significant portion of the Taliban and other insurgent funding that comes directly from the sale and trade of opium. But countries outside the region, in fact, all across Western Europe and across Central Asia, have a huge interest in dealing with this issue because of what it does to them at home. And as you see from this chart, this is a chart of where the heroin goes when it originates from Afghanistan. And the tentacles are absolutely amazing in that they touch almost every single country in the region. And Britain, for example, 90% of the heroin consumed in Britain comes from Afghanistan as its origin. This is why Afghanistan matters in terms of the poppies it produces. This is a chart of production where between every little light gray bar is about 1,000 metric tons of production of opium. As you can see, in 1994, it was variously randomly split from Afghanistan's production compared to the rest of the world. As you went into the 2000s, particularly 2007, 2008, Afghanistan made up 95% of the world's production of opium. So if you wanted to deal with heroin and opium, you had to deal with Afghanistan. As you'll note too, and we'll get to this in a minute, but there's an interesting, very rapid drop-off between 2009 and 2010 of the production inside Afghanistan. And that, the question is, was that counter-narcotics activities that did it? It turns out that the land production really pretty much stayed the same. It was a disease that came through and killed a lot of the crops last year. So we lost half of the crop, but prices increased by 300% over the last year. We've taken a variety. The United States and the Afghan government have evolved over the years to how they are dealing with this problem. And there's a variety of incarnations that we talk about inside the book chapter. But in general, there's a series of 5 different pillars that both we and our allies and the Afghan government have adopted to try and stamp out the production of opium in the country. And it's really described by these 5 different pillars. 1 is eradication, which is the direct destruction of the crops themselves. 2 is public information to try and educate people as to why they shouldn't be growing it. 3 is alternative livelihood development, which is trying to take people who grow poppies and give them another way to make their living. 4 is judicial reform. And 5 is drug interdiction, which really focuses on the trafficking of the drugs themselves. And in this case study, what we wanted to do is to look at the impact on the farmers themselves, because when you go into these types of situations, the easiest thing to think about doing is to say, there's too much poppy being produced, let's stamp it out. And that is kind of the first and most obvious solution to pursue, but in a lot of ways is the worst. And so the first 3 here, eradication, public information, alternative livelihood development, are the parts of the strategy focused directly on the farmers, and that's why we focused on those particularly in the case study. And what we found was that 3 major lessons learned from pursuing these different strategies. And the first one that really jumps out is how bad eradication can be for the farmers and how counterproductive eradication can be when pursued in a vacuum. And the way we framed it was to say that counter-narcotics efforts should not punish the poppy farmers because they represent the most vulnerable and victimized link in the opium trade. Of the entire opium supply chain, the farmers make by far the least amount, but by far the most victimized by the policies that go after the production of the opium itself. And the important thing here is for people to understand that the farmers don't produce poppy, they don't, the precursor to opium and heroin, because they want to. They don't do it because they want to do something illegal or because they want to do something they think is un-Islamic. They do it because a confluence of factors shows them that they kind of have to in many regards. And there are really 3 different major reasons that force people into this type of operation. The first is agricultural. Agriculturally, poppy is just the perfect plant to grow in Afghanistan. It's very drought resistant. It grows all over the country. As we saw before with the picture, it dries into a latex that you can scrape off and you can store for months at a time. So it's not like if you keep it for too long, it'll go bad. It'll keep it for as long as you want to keep it, and when you can get it to market, then you can actually sell it. It's also a very nice thing for people to grow as part of a rotation of crops. So it's not like poppy farmers grow poppy and poppy only. They can grow wheat. They can grow a variety of other crops as well as this included in their portfolio. The second is really the economic forces, and this is probably the most important. The prices go up, as with any other agriculture commodity, the prices for poppy go up and down quite a bit. But in many years, across the last 10 years, poppy has been worth far more than other crops such as wheat. And so it attracts farmers to it because it can make them the most money for the same amount of effort they put into other things. Growing poppy is also very labor intensive, so it takes a lot of people to go out to the fields to tend the fields, so it employs a lot of people. And so even the farmers who aren't necessarily geared towards that have people come to them to get some work because that's where they can actually do it. It's also, and interestingly, kind of counterintuitively, growing poppy is a good source of credit and loans for farmers. And while you may think of that in a bad way, that they take on the loans to have all this debt that they then have to repay, and in some instances that has been the case, the research has shown that by and large, getting these loans and growing poppy has very much benefited these farmers. It's kept them more out of debt, than in debt. So it's a very interesting type of cycle. And the third factor is really security, and as you see where poppy is grown across the country, it's now very heavily concentrated. 98% have concentrated in the 7 regions that the Taliban controls for the most part. Although in the last couple of years, with the price increase, it has spread again to the north and east of the regions. But really, the security factor plays a lot into it. And one of the most direct impacts on the farmers is that for poppy, they don't have to transport it themselves to the market because the opium traders are willing to come to them to purchase it. So they don't have to travel the roads. They don't have to get harassed on the way by the Taliban and the narco-traffickers and the criminals and everybody else who takes a slice of what they take as they go along. So it's a much more secure way for them to operate. Our second lesson learned was that large-scale eradication, and it's related to the first, large-scale eradication should not be undertaken until viable alternatives to poppy have been established. And what we mean by this is that farmers who are subject to eradication a lot of times are far worse off than they were, as you would expect, before they had their crops destroyed. Particularly those who had their crops destroyed right before the harvesting season, because if the government comes in, destroys the crops, they have absolutely no other way to make money, which in many cases just forces them to grow the highest value crop for the next season that they can, which most of the time, again, is poppy. So it forces you into that type of cycle. Also, the groups like the Taliban are able to take advantage of this type of situation because they can go to the poppy farmers and say, listen, the government's coming after you. We can protect you. We will send our forces here when the government forces come to eradicate if you help support us, if you provide us with information, and a variety of different other ways if you join as fighters and whatnot. And so when the government goes in to eradicate without doing anything else to help the farmers, all it does is push those farmers more into the insurgency movement. And finally, this is related to the other point as well, is that because of the complexity of the various factors that influence poppy cultivation, the success of particular policies and programs can and should only be judged over the long term. And the perfect example of this, as shown by this plot, was Nangarhar province, which is in the eastern portion of the country, which between 2004 and 2005 received a 96% decrease in the amount of poppies produced in their province. And the reason was because a USAID program came in. They worked with the local provincial governor who was willing to put his political will behind getting people to switch away from growing poppy into growing actually legitimate crops in their province. And the people bought on. People wanted to be legitimate. They wanted to get out of the reach of the security impacts that were happening to them. So everybody truly, it seems that they joined together, decided not to do this anymore, and to try to make a living another way, and received a major decrease in their poppy production. It's very impressive. But the program was not necessarily pursued over the long term. Agricultural factors changed, economic factors changed, and the farmers found out that they could not make as much money the next year as they made the previous year growing the poppy, and so they just moved back to it up to the point of 2007 where their production was back to the levels where it was before. So it's the message here is that when you put in a counter-narcotics policy, you cannot look at it just after 1 year and say we've had success or we've had failure, because there are so many other factors that go into it that you have to take a holistic view of your policies and the impact that they had in the context of everything else that was going on. And that is it for me. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Mami Sato. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Tokyo, and I'll be presenting the case about the DDR and natural resources in Afghanistan. Some of my presentations, it'll be linking a lot with what David has just presented. So if you could use the information he has presented, link it with mine, that would be wonderful. As you all may know, and David has already presented, Afghanistan was until recently under conflict and is still in a very unstable situation. To the situation of Afghanistan, Japan has been assisting in many fields from before the Bonn Agreement in December 2001, including DDR and agriculture supports. And as for DDR, Japan with the UN was the lead donor country. In my presentation, first I'll be explaining about the DDR and the agriculture supports by the Japanese government, each followed by lessons learned from the case. Then I'll be focusing on specific outcomes from the case. The aim of the DDR is to disarm the combatants and help reintegrate into civil society. In the case of Afghanistan, there were 4 objectives, which were to build a sustainable peace framework with Afghan National Army being the only military force, disorganization of the old National Army across the country, promotion of the socio-economic development, and environmental making for the liberty and justice of the first election after peace agreement. And the project in the reintegration phase provided hands-on skills programs for the ex-combatants, which included vocational trainings, agriculture program, and helping to start small business and others. Although they were able to disarm and demobilize 63,380 people and reintegrate 55,804 people, there were several lessons to be learned from this project. The positive effects were that they were able to canton heavy weapons in Afghanistan, which brought human security, and the people were actually able to feel that they were secure. And the Japanese government achieved to open up a new field in their assistance as donor countries. But the negative effects were that the limitation of the target left the issue of the illegally armed groups, and the lack of coordination between the international agencies caused ineffectiveness in the operation. And lastly, too much focus on the vocational training rather than the agriculture supports led to an unsustainable livelihood support. Especially in the latter part of my presentation, I'll be focusing on the last point on this slide, along with the lessons learned from the agricultural supports, which I will be moving on to next. As an agriculture support, Japan has been implementing several projects which they excel at most in their aiding field. The lists are some of the projects implemented, and there are more new projects that are being launched now. While several big scale projects by the grant aid has been implemented, there were also projects implemented by the NGOs. I have not studied each project in the detail in my case, but as an overall, several lessons were to be seen. As it was the case of the first presentation by David, the poppy cultivation, there are several reasons why poppy cultivation increases. For example, water shortage, like droughts, bad access to the market, leading to low price selling, and the lack of techniques for processing and preserving their crops. And the poppy cultivation are free from all these problems. However, there was a gap between the projects and the recipients the Afghan farmers needs. The farmers needed means of preserving and processing to be able to sell products in a higher price, and the development of linkage between the producers and the market. And it is likely that this gap, which attributes to an unstable income of the farmers, can bring out the motive of the farmers to be rearmed. Another affecting point was that the limitation of the project areas due to security instability and the trend of choosing areas where the basic infrastructure of agriculture are in place may give room for the Taliban to step in. In this presentation, by focusing on the gap which may motivate to being rearmed or shifting to poppy cultivation, which can create unstable security, and focusing on the point from the DDR about the disregard of the agriculture supports, I would like to present the overall lessons learned about the DDR and the agriculture supports. In the reintegration phase of the DDR, 43% of the ex-combatants chose agricultural supports, which could be understood with 80% of the people being farmers in the country. However, in the actual implementation of the project, the selection of the agricultural program was limited to only the people who had land to cultivate. And even if they had land to cultivate, the program was provided with only the distribution of seeds and fertilizers for one time. There was no support on the technical assistance, let alone the assistance for the water shortage problems. Of course, no follow-ups were performed. Nevertheless, the farmland situations in Afghanistan were that the arable land was diminishing because of many irrigation systems being destroyed, inadequate water management, droughts, deforestation, and loss of pasture lands. And many farmer lands lack not only the irrigations, but the basic infrastructure indispensable for agriculture, and the establishment of the land tenure. It is estimated that there were 790,000 refugees and IDPs having returned to the farming sector, some resettling and others returning to their homes. Due to these situations, there were people who would not use the seeds and fertilizers that they were distributed to cultivate, but would sell them to gain money. The program also lacked in providing basic education and in solving the vulnerability of agriculture structure itself. From the questionnaire conducted to the students at University of Kabul in Afghanistan, the results of Figure 3 and 4 were obtained. The question was whether they knew anyone who had joined the DDR but had gone back to be rearmed because they could not get enough earning. Both the farmers and non-farmers were seen to be rearmed. More people in the non-farmers are seen in Figure 4. This can be assumed by reason that the people who chose vocational trainings once had a job when many constructions were being done, but are now seeking for work. However, for the farmers, from the interviews, it was said that by shifting the crops to poppy, the farmers are able to solve the problem of water shortage, market, and buying seeds and make stable income. But this poppy production of short-term profits then compounds the long-term instability and insecurity in the region, as it was already mentioned in the first presentation. And it creates a limitation of the agriculture support projects by the Japanese government and other countries also. And it's creating a downward spiral. And concluding this first bullet, insufficiency of the reintegration phase indicates as one of the cause of the security issues prolonging even after DDR. It also relates to the second conclusion of how the mismatch would affect the security stability as well. Therefore, it can be said that the long-term effectiveness of DDR is also dependent on the post-war aid and agriculture assisting projects. Finally, I'd like to finish by a recommendation from this case study that DDR and agriculture assistance are really closely related in the aspect of security issues. And so, in a post-conflict society, it is important to take into consideration the relation between DDR and the content of assistance of projects for post-DDR society. However, when doing so, the aid project should not only focus on the ex-combatants, but also the general public to avoid the frustration within the community due to inequity that might set off another conflict in the country. Thank you very much.
Good morning again. Thank you very much, Carl. On behalf of Will Rogers from the Center on New American Security, my co-author in the piece, we thank you for this opportunity to perhaps be slightly different on this panel, and that's not just because we're the only paper not focusing on Afghanistan. But we are, as Carl promised, there's diversity here in many ways. And in conceiving of this chapter and conversations with Carl, this has a mind of its own. We had a conversation about a set of actors that aren't necessarily explicitly part of this discussion, at least as for me, much of the natural resources and peacebuilding discussion has been framed, and that's militaries. And so what we tried to tackle really just in an initial stage was to recognize that there's a lot of activity between militaries talking about collaborating on, trying to better understand, trying to respond to some of the challenges around natural resources, but also responding to natural disasters or, importantly, preparing for them. And so this is, in some ways, a modest offering to try to set an agenda that includes these kinds of issues for the discussion. It doesn't necessarily have kind of hardcore findings based on wide set of case analysis, but gives some examples to show that it's worthy of taking a longer look at to understand where it may be working, where it may be failing, where it's appropriate, where it's inappropriate, mismatched. But nevertheless, that there's a there already, and we need to have this be part of the conversation. And so in this sense, what we're looking at is instances where, in part, different sets of relationships that may be between governments and militaries that are quite friendly, others where situations are unsettled, explicitly, obviously. In this context, ones where coming out of conflict and in a peace-building context, although we'll say a little bit about how we see that as a broader rather than a narrow construction of that term. But using, in some ways, at times, the fact that these issues aren't contentious as an opportunity for dialogue, some of the shared challenges. And so this is some of the ways that these mechanisms can go forward. It is really trying to use this dialogue, yes, for trying to accomplish some environmental or natural resource management purposes, but perhaps most importantly, trying to find ways to have conversations, to build trust, to develop relationships, to build confidence, and then hopefully be part of a peace, part of the peace building. And so in that sense, it is really a stability, security, conflict, peace building goal where the environmental dialogue is a means as well as potentially an end, but is serving as a means here to a security end. Sorry, this thing really does have a mind of its own. You're getting a preview of what's coming. As I said, different status between the relationships between militaries. This notion of really, in some ways, very modest in terms of getting to know one another, building that relationship. And we'll hear some of the examples from Will in terms of how that's playing. Some opportunities to institutionalize some critical professional kind of norms of practice, such as civilian control of the military, that are hoped for outcomes that, again, are not necessarily environment part of doing that. And that we see examples on the natural disasters where the militaries are often also called into play, but trying to get ahead of that with some of joint natural disaster preparedness training and such, joint environmental assessments of conditions where there's cooperation. It's not necessarily where the natural resources are the bone of contention. In fact, there are a number of issues where it's less, it's not the high politics issue, it's a lower politics issue. It's not necessarily critical to the conflict. It gives you that opportunity to have these conversations. I mentioned our notion of peace building, and we I don't know whether we kind of challenged the whole enterprise, but we made a case to Carl and Mickey and company that I think they were gracious enough to let us at least make the case, and we'll see whether others buy it. But if we fall back on, or if we refer to the notion that Collier and company have given us, or the kind of data point, so to speak, that in post-conflict settings, 47% of them fall back into conflict within 5 years. Our argument would be some of the examples that we're putting out that would typically be put in a prevention category, not a peace-building category, are in fact appropriate to be discussed in peace building, because as soon as we're in peace building, we're by definition doing prevention, because we're trying to avoid being part of that half that fall back into conflict. And so in this respect, you will see from the examples that there, if you had a kind of a linear continuum, then it would really kind of, in some ways, critique that notion that it's linear prevention in times of conflict and peace building, but see it as circular. And so you're doing the peace building, you're doing the prevention when you're in the period of peace building. And so that is in part how we rationalize having this discussion within this context, but gives us an opportunity, hopefully, to also challenge some of our held assumptions on what it is that constitutes that. So I'll turn the floor over to Will and this computer with a mind of its own to talk about some of the examples and some of the cautionary notes.
Thank you, Jeff. You've seen some of my talking points as a preview already, so I'll get there quickly. What I wanted to do very quickly is give you a brief overview of the cases that we looked at, so the lessons, the brief lessons learned, and where we go from here. And so you see here, as Jeff mentioned, we didn't do a systemic analysis of all the cases where military cooperation around the environment is happening. We focused on a handful of international case studies. But really the focus was on the U.S. military and what the U.S. military has been doing and cooperating with partners around the world around the environment and natural disasters. And so we need to further analyze non-U.S. case studies. But one of the things that's instructive about this is that the U.S. military has been involved for a long time, has a rich history of this kind of cooperation. And so I think there is a opportunity for sustaining this level or this kind of engagement moving forward. And I think that's instructive and a valuable lesson. I think I wish we had time to go into all the different missions that we reviewed in the case study here. But one that I think really kind of crystallizes the utility of this effort is an old example from the Cold War, which was the Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation. And what you had here is we had Cold War adversaries, the United States, Norway, and the Soviet Union, getting together to cooperate militarily around the environment, and specifically to reduce environmental impact of their naval presence, Arctic early warning radar systems that were up in the Arctic, and to reduce toxic waste dumps and to cooperate with around nuclear and non-nuclear sites to reduce the environmental impact. And so, while, as Jeff mentioned, the environment was really a means to this kind of cooperation, the benefit of this cooperation was that rather than these Cold War adversaries really kind of just, to date they had been really looking over the Iron Curtain and glaring at each other. Instead, you have them working together in the Arctic and developing institutional links and relationships that were actually really beneficial to building the kinds of exchanges that improve transparency, and a list of other peace dividends that Jeff sort of alluded to here. And so this is one of the examples that really crystallizes what we're talking about. More recently, what's been in the news recently is the United States and Vietnam cooperating with naval exchanges in the South China Sea. A lot of these activities have been non-combat activities, and while they haven't been focused around the environment, you've seen that there is an element of resiliency building between the U.S. and Vietnamese navies, specifically around search and rescue missions, which I think you're going to see is extremely important, especially for Vietnam's resiliency to climate change, when those impacts take effect across the region. And so though we have, we've seen there are some successes that we can derive from these exchanges, but there are very obvious cautionary notes. And I think the very first one that's important is that military cooperation is really, it's part of the ongoing struggle to find an acceptable and appropriate balance between military and development activities. And folks from USAID who work with DoD partners know that struggle is ongoing. One of the military often has the capability and the personnel to respond quickly to address environmental concerns and natural disasters. And a lot of the civilian institutions don't have that capability, in part because they're critically underfunded. And so I think one of the cautionary notes is that we really need to strike a balance and find an acceptable balance for the two agencies to work together. Oftentimes what the military will find is that civilian agencies have critical information that it will actually benefit them in these kind of cooperative exchanges. As Carl mentioned up front, dropping wells in a post-conflict setting can be, hazardous to the peace-building effort if you don't have the information that you need. And so our civilian partners actually may have that information, and so it behooves the military and the development community to work together to make sure that these peace-building efforts are actually sustainable. Military-to-military cooperation is, it's a low politics framework. You don't lose a lot in cooperating around the environment, but there are some instances in which, excuse me for this PowerPoint here. there are some instances in which high politics conflicts associated with the international disputes over high value issues, whether it's nuclear disarmament, these kind of things, will eclipse sort of these efforts to build peace through environmental cooperation. So you really need to be attuned to that. We saw this especially with between Pakistan and India back in 2005. This is a case that we look at in our chapter. But the two states couldn't cooperate around earthquake response because they haggled over who got I think the Pakistanis wanted to pilot Indian aircraft that the Indians had graciously allowed lended to the Pakistanis to provide search and rescue support, and so that kind of fell through. And so you saw an instance where this sort of high politics tension really took the wind out of the sails of any kind of cooperation in this instance. And finally, one of the cautionary notes here is that this is not an effective strategy in all situations. Militaries are not always going to be able to cooperate, in every situation, in part because there are sovereignty concerns. Some states will, even though it behooves them to cooperate around the environment, there's a greater concern that they'll concede a certain amount of sovereignty in cooperating with militaries. And so we need to really be sensitive to this international dynamic. Let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, so next steps. Where do we go from here? Well, as Jeff mentioned, we do need to study more non-U.S. case studies and draw out some broader patterns and lessons learned. And really, we need a systemic assessment of the successes and failures. We've looked at a handful where these kinds of exchanges are successful, but we need to identify the failures as well so that we can appropriately derive lessons learned to where we can make improvements around this framework. I don't know why these are disappearing now. Okay. We need to move from this dead-end notion of green helmets to a more productive integration of green advisors with blue helmets, specifically within the UN peacebuilding framework. Former Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev and former UNIP Director Klaus Topfer had this initial idea of having green helmets, but that fell short because, again, the partners involved were feared a dissolution of the principles of sovereignty over having a peacebuilding effort around with this green helmets initiative. And so UNIP Director Achim Steiner's had a more practical approach, which is that we should integrate green advisors with blue helmets. And so you have a real integration of environmental considerations into the traditional UN peacebuilding framework. And I think there's an that's a more acceptable and pragmatic approach to really integrating natural resources into the post-conflict peacebuilding effort. And finally, you've seen it again. It's going to keep coming back here. Okay. Finally, we need to utilize climate change, excuse me, as an opportunity for military-to-military environmental engagement, especially around climate adaptation. It's no surprise that a lot of the countries that are going to be most impacted by climate change are the developing countries that don't have adequate military capability or civilian capability to respond or to be resilient enough to respond to the impacts of that a lot of scientists predict will occur due to climate change. And so what we're seeing here is there's an opportunity for not just the U.S. military, but other militaries to cooperate with less developed partners to build the capacity around climate adaptation, but also resiliency. Natural disaster preparedness, I think, will become more important as states that are prone to increased frequency and more devastating disasters need to have that kind of response capability. I guess we're done there. So if we look forward to your questions and thank you. So.
And after this last presentation, we will have a time for question and answer and discussions.
Thank you, Carl. I'm John Unruh, and together with my colleague Murad Shalabi, both of us were with the Department of Geography at McGill University. We have looked at a particular aspect of peacebuilding, which is the intersection of road reconstruction and land rights. So those are two thrusts, two pillars of peace building. And one thing that we're interested in is how these two aspects of peace building interact with each other among a recipient population on the ground. And some of the problems that go into pursuing separately peace building endeavors that are planned separately, programmed separately, but arrive in the same place among the same host population. And so what we've done is to explore this interaction between land rights, which the government and the international community would like to stabilize in Afghanistan, and road reconstruction, which is thought to be a big thrust forward for service acquisition and for development in the country. So we're looking at the interaction of these two things. Road reconstruction in Afghanistan is an enormous endeavor. And so it's second in expenditure only to security. And there's a host of donors involved. The Americans, the Japanese are, of course, the primary donors in this effort. There is a couple of aspects of this map I'd like for you to look at. One is this ring road, this donut that's there. That's a primary effort. And there's feeder roads that come off of that, secondary, tertiary roads, and bridges, all of which are going to connect Afghanistan with itself and with the broader region. And the logic there is fairly straightforward. Okay, it's the same logic that is employed with roads itself and road construction itself in all kinds of settings, including stable settings. So this page here was taken from an American document on road reconstruction in Afghanistan, and it's got the objective, right, the road classification, and then why. Okay, so the why is interesting here, and these are pretty much off-the-shelf good things that roads are for. Promoting trade and economic linkages, extend regional highways to provincial capitals, contributing to peace, security, stability, economic growth, national integration, all good things. Okay, so these are things that we think, of course, roads will provide to a local community, to a nation, and so in this way, it's fundamental to nation building and to a contribution to durable peace. With this road effort, there's been some fairly lofty calculations, right? 60% of Afghans will live within 50 kilometers of this ring road, okay? 5.3 million people are thought to benefit by improving economic access, services, et cetera. So this is the calculation behind road reconstruction in Afghanistan. All good things. Clearly, there's no downside to this very expensive effort. What we're asking and what we're looking at, though, is that this road reconstruction effort does not arrive in a stable setting in Afghanistan. It arrives in a landscape where things are very difficult, things are unstable. Rule of law can be very difficult. It can be twisted, it can be abusive, it can be absent. Services are an interesting feature of road reconstruction, and you see services connected to road reconstruction a lot. Roads provide access to services, but they don't provide the services. They don't stamp out corruption. They don't create the services themselves. So that the link there between the roads and the services are a bit problematic, and in some cases backwards. Okay, and we see this in Afghanistan. Okay, so this logic of roads provide access to services assumes that the services are good things, that they are peace-building efforts themselves, provided by government, provided by the private sector, et cetera, and that these things are good for people, and all people need to do is get access to the schools, the courts, the health clinics, et cetera, and that will be a step forward in terms of peace building. But insurgent groups are into this, and some insurgent groups, like the Taliban, are very keen on providing their own services. Okay, so in this regard, if an increase in the ease with which you're able to move around due to roads also provides an increase with which Taliban services can be accessed, then is that a step forward to durable peace? Or are we detracting from durable peace and actually adding to the insurgency? And there's an interesting case study with court systems specifically in terms of roads. In the cities, it's been noted that with road reconstructions, it's now easier, of course, for people from the hinterland to access the cities. And the thinking there is that if you have a problem and you need court services, you need rule of law, you can come from the hinterland into the city and access those things. Turns out it's the reverse, okay? It's the city dwellers who have the most access to statutory rule of law, court systems, et cetera, that are using the roads to go out into the Taliban-occupied areas and seek justice, seek court systems in Taliban courts. It's quicker, it's cheaper, it's more accessible, okay? It has a form of legitimacy, but you get buy-in, right? Both parties do walk away from the court proceeding in Taliban-held areas with the deal done, okay? The court systems in the cities that they live right next door to are corrupt. Okay, they're very expensive, they're problematic, and the legitimacy can be low, and the trust can be low in terms of an outcome. So, in this case, the roads and access to justice systems operates in reverse, and it adds to what the Taliban do. So, the logic that we see in road reconstruction and how it operates in stable settings is quite problematic in areas like Afghanistan. I want to go over some of the primary outcomes of this interaction between land rights, what we call land tenure, in a rural Afghanistan and road reconstruction. The first that we see is that there's this enormous upsurge in land values, okay? But the problem there is that most land is held customarily. Okay, meaning not with a title, not with statutory rule of law backing you up, et cetera. It's held by lineages and customary groups and indigenous ways of legitimacy. And that's a problem, okay? If a road goes through an area and land is held informally like that, the value skyrockets. A wealthy or powerful individual or group can come down the road and grab this now much more valuable land. Okay, and so we have this enormous increase in land grabbing to the degree that it's thought to be a significant flashpoint for return to armed conflict. And here's just some details of this. Of the 9 provinces in Afghanistan where land grabbing is the greatest, all were along that ring road that we saw. Okay, 6 of these had 80% or more of the land grabbed. A couple have had 100 or 200% of the land grabbed, meaning the land gets grabbed and grabbed again. So you have now this interaction, never mind the smallholder who's been scooted off the land, but you have this tension between powerful interests, okay, grabbing now land from each other. And so land grabbing is this pervasive, chaotic, out of control, unwieldy endeavor that's going on. And we're seeing a big contributor to this is this road reconstruction and the much greater ease with which people can get around, but most importantly, the huge increase in land values due to proximity to roads, okay, which means access to markets, et cetera. And so you might imagine a business, right, interest would be just in the speculation of high-value lands, okay? Of course, roads attract certain things. Landmines, explosives, et cetera, are located along new roads. And so these new roads are heavily targeted by Taliban insurgents. The new roads, from a military point of view, are great. You can get around quicker. You can pursue X or Y problem very rapidly. And so that's good from a military point of view. And from a military point of view, that can be the reason for the roads in the first place. From a local community point of view, this is not what you want. You do not want the militaries of the Taliban or the coalition forces showing up in your backyard to be pursued by their opposing side in your farming area where there didn't used to be any of this prior to the roads. And I like this quote by a local resident. Foreign forces come to our village and said they want to asphalt the road, but we say no. We know the road is good, but we also know the road brings patrols and with them suicide and roadside attacks. There's also stories where you have road reconstruction engaged in bridge building, okay? The civil engineers move on. The areas are accessed now by Taliban forces and by land grabbers. The local community will then ask coalition forces to blow the bridge up, right? So that they can become, or they can return to being isolated and therefore protected from a very volatile landscape that is around them. And I'll just wrap up with this and then the 2 large lessons learned. The big issue is that planners for these different components of peace building pursue them separately. The civil engineers pursue road building, okay? The land rights folks and the lawyers pursue land rights stabilization. But they both arrive at a recipient population at the same time, in the same area, same people, and they interact on the ground. And so that interaction needs to be taken into account. That's the first lesson. The second is it's difficult to think that we can just take something off the shelf, something as simple and straightforward as road reconstruction, it's just engineering, and throw it at a post-war scenario and think that it's going to operate the same way that it does in North America or in Europe. Okay, so we have to take this greater notion into account, which Carl highlighted earlier, that conflict-affected situations, post-war situations are dramatically different in how they function. And so it means a very big difference in terms of our security and development efforts in that regard. Right? Thanks.
We have about 20 minutes for discussion. And we have two roving mics, one on each side, if we have people to help with them. I would like to open the floor up for discussion, maybe take a few questions or comments, and then have the panel respond if we have time for another round. When you speak, if you could introduce who you are and which organization you're with. Ken in the back.
Ken Conca from American University. I had a question for John, a very interesting and provocative presentation. I wanted to ask you to unpack a little bit what it is about road building that actually increases land values, because it seems that there may be several different sorts of effects going on there. One is that there's real productive opportunities or access to markets that now exist that didn't exist previously. A second would be this sort of speculative and bubble kind of dynamic. And also, it depends on what other kind of investment opportunities there are in the economy, and particularly in an inflationary economy, putting money into land might be an attractive alternative and so on and so forth. So to what extent is the rise in land value a reflection of the land is a real productive asset, and to what extent is it being driven by some of the other maybe unstable dynamics in the Afghan economy where it's a more inflationary and speculative kind of investment choice that people are making? And then a second question, if I may, is value for whom? Obviously, the grabbing seems to sort of concentrate and favor larger holders over small holders and so on, but independent of that, do the roads create productive opportunities and value for smallholders, or do they really sort of shift the way that land is going to be used and who can benefit from that value potential?
And there was a woman there. Sorry, about 3 rows up from Ken.
Thank you. Brooke Stearns-Lawson. I'm a Counter-Narcotics and Crime Advisor for USAID's Africa Bureau. Question primarily, I think, to David, but I'm welcome comments from anyone. Given the experience in Nangarhar that you highlighted in your presentation and throughout the world in terms of the difficulties of providing alternative livelihoods that compete from a pure economic income generation benefit, were there lessons either in the case or in the background materials that help understand how we can shift the cost-benefit equation for producers and traffickers or transporters of illicit economic goods?
And there was one in the back corner.
Hi, my name is Mariko Schmitz. I work for JICA. I'd like to tack on a question to the road building questions earlier. The presentation seemed to say you could either build an asphalt road, which would enable the military forces to use it, or you could not build a road, and therefore the villagers would avoid all the negative aspects of having the military around. My question is, is it possible to build a road that maybe would be less useful for the military, but also be something that the villagers could use that would be safer than an asphalt road?
Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet here in Washington, D.C. But my question is the follow-on to the road building and then, of course, the global distribution of the narcotics. What local markets and maybe even international export markets are being developed for alternative crops that can be used, both consumed by local populations and also for export to the neighbors in the area?
Okay, last question, then we'll go to the panel. Should have a couple rounds of this piece.
Hi, my name's Bob Menz. I'm just a phys ed teacher from Rochester, New York. I teach in an urban center. Drugs kill my kids and my kids' families. Violence permeates every center city in America, one of the problems being drugs. As an American citizen, it sounds harsh, but I don't give a darn about the Taliban or the farmers. I'd like to see them eradicate everything. Bring out the old Agent Orange and dump it on the land, you know, because it's killing my kids that I teach. So I understood that in the past the Canadian government had a program with poppy farmers to they'd make an X amount of poppies for medical use, and then try to give them a stipend so they wouldn't farm. How did that turn out? Thanks.
Very good questions. The first, with regard to the value of lands that are in proximity to roads or reconstructed roads, and the nature of that value. Certainly, part of it is the prospect of increased agricultural production, but most importantly, you could imagine that even without a road, you could produce a great deal on certain lands because they're fertile and well watered, et cetera. If they're close to lands, of course, you can produce a lot and sell it, and so there's that aspect of it. So part of the logic of roads are good because it provides access to markets. Certainly, that's true, but the question alluded to it. Good for who? If you just look at it from a pure agricultural production standpoint, and who cares who owns the land, et cetera, then okay, you get greater produce, it gets on the road, it goes to market, everything's good, except that by dislocating the small holders, right, on the land that they viewed as their land, they go to where? To seek justice. They go to the insurgents, okay? And so if they go to the insurgents, and the insurgents actually have their hand out, and they're inviting them in to seek justice and retribution, particularly if it's against the state or against a large landholder who's grabbed their land with a land title or with a local militia, you could imagine that not only drives the dislocated small-scale landholders into the Taliban, but that creates a flashpoint whereby the Taliban now has a reason to interact with the state and engage the state. Next door in Pakistan, the primary thinking of why the initial problem in the Swat Valley soured so quickly was for this very reason. Land holdings were being gobbled up by large land interests. The small-scale agriculturalists who previously held the land was unable to get justice from the government, and so went into the Taliban. The Taliban issue there grew, and that was the reason why the Swat Valley came online as a very tense and conflicted area. So it's more involved, and it is difficult to talk to civil engineers about these sort of knock-on effects, where you may achieve the goal of greater agricultural production and moving that production to the cities and around. But what you're also doing is allowing previous owners who held it informally to be dislocated, and then what? All right, so the civil engineer is not going to follow that dislocated population wherever they may end up and what their actions might be. Some of those dislocated persons are actually mining their own land, right? So they're putting landmines in their own land in order to prevent them from being grabbed. So again, it's an example where road reconstruction and some of the follow-on effects, greater access to markets, happen, but they also create a problem that would not occur in a stable setting. And so that does create this sort of, I think Kenneth alluded to it, this market in speculation, okay? So you can imagine that a connected interest to the state or a warlord could arrive, grab some land because a road's going in, never thinking they're going to produce off of it, but that they're going to sell it later, all right, to someone else. So it's this combination of that speculation together with the knowledge that the end point of the conflict is closer than it used to be. And if you want land, you better get it now, because when things solidify, it's sort of like musical chairs. Whoever's sitting in a chair gets to keep it, right? Along comes the titling program, and if I'm there instead of you, I'll get the title and not you. So it's a bit of a land rush, right? It's a bit of a tragedy of the commons in a twisted way, where you're trying to race for a resource before the bell sounds and things get calm and solidified, and rule of law comes later. So the questions of all these sort of immediate good things that are thought to follow road reconstruction. It's not to say that they don't happen. They frequently can, but there's also repercussions to those things that actually detract from durable peace. That's sort of a wide-ranging answer. Are there types of roads that can be built that are good for the local villagers, but less so for militaries, et cetera? I think you have to get to the reason for the roads themselves. The reasons would be to access services, and roads don't create services, right? So that's an interesting prospect. Are there kinds of roads that are good for horse-drawn carriages or something like that, and not for big tanks or et cetera? Except the Taliban get around however they want in modern or less modern conveyances. I guess I would argue in that regard that you place the services out where they're needed, so that the travel time and the need for roads in an early phase of reconstruction really isn't as dire, isn't needed. And so what we're getting at around the edges are how road reconstruction needs to happen. Do we need to sequence it with parts of the peace process? If we come in too early, when things are still very volatile, it may go off, the results may go off in a direction we don't want. But if it's sequenced after other things are in place, services, legitimate rule of law, et cetera, then we may see road reconstruction arriving and having benefits more aligned with our objectives.
Okay. I'll take these a bit out of order and try to do them briefly. So Sam, you had asked, and I apologize if I misheard your names, but Sam, you had asked about the markets and the export markets being developed for other products besides poppy. And was it Brooke? Brooke probably knows much more about this than I do about USAID's projects they develop in that region. But there is a large focus on developing alternative crops so that they can make a living doing something else, but still using their farming skills. The problem, really, there's two problems with it. One is the value proposition, is that what they give them to grow, whether it be pistachios or pomegranates, just don't sell for as much as poppies do. And so convincing someone to take less money for doing the same thing can be a tough thing to do in certain situations. The other is that the major problem you see with these is that it takes a lot of time sometimes. It can take sometimes 5 or 6 years for these crops to develop into something that they can produce on a sustainable annual basis. And then the question is, what do you do in the meantime? You know, so they may be able to get through the first year or two, but if something happens to the other crops that they're growing and they have no hedge or they have nothing else that they can fall back on, and they need to find a loan so they can grow something else, then the draw to poppies is very strong. So the two very strong problems that focused on that, but AID does try to develop those. Bob, your point about just eradicate them in general and just do what we can to get rid of the crops.
Well, as American citizens, sir, it's the United States of America, not the United States of the Pacific Rim and everything else. I know it goes against the Wilson Center, but from my point of view, here we have, it's almost every center city in America, we're losing generation after generation of child.
Mm-hmm.
And they're American citizens. Where's our trust? Where's our dedication should be to our own citizens first. So in nation building, which I sinkhole. Have we lost our mind? So I'm sorry, that's just my point of view.
Okay.
Sir.
No, no.
What can we do to help these families who are being destroyed by drugs?
Right, right. No, I understand your point. A lot of the issues over there are, it's a extremely corrupt country at the moment. There's a lot of corruption that runs at all levels. So getting any program to be actually effective over there is a very big challenge. I'll go back to the point of the eradication piece is to go in there and just do a chemical eradication with Agent Orange and whatnot. It's a tough thing to do because it does tend to be more counterproductive than productive. But if we were really interested in taking care of it, I would suggest more of a focus on the narco traffickers would be a much better thing to do than to focus on the aerial eradication and whatnot. I know I'm not getting at your total point, but there are things that we can do that would be cost effective to go and do that. And it seems that operating in the environment that we've been operating in the last 10 years is just a very hard way to spend money effectively and on a cost effective basis for the long haul. And Brooke, I'm sorry, would you mind restating your question? I didn't quite get the crux of what you were getting at.
Just if there are any lessons learned. I mean, if you're looking at the value equation, it's very difficult to provide an alternative livelihood that can truly compete with either production or trafficking. So if there were lessons learned about how to effectively shift that cost equation. And it does go to this gentleman's point, because at the end of the day, if our counter-narcotics efforts are not effective, it is going to bring the problem home. And evidence has shown from the Ram Corporation and others that crop eradication alone actually does not.
Sorry, could you use the microphone for the people who are?
I'm done.
Okay. Well, it's a good point, and what we were just talking about, that it's hard to get a crop that makes as much money as poppy does. But there have been good signs that people are willing to actually produce wheat and to produce other crops that can make them a living and may not make them the best living if they can get out of the security situation that they're in. If it can solve some of the other problems, they're willing to trade a bit of that income to do it. I think the hard problem with this is sustaining political will of the local population over a long term, and that was kind of the lesson learned from Nangarhar, was that the local provincial governor was very much supportive of this program, was personally engaged in working with AID to get the seeds distributed and the tools and everything else that they did to make that successful for that particular 1 year. But the leadership changes very quickly, and just because the provincial governor is supportive doesn't mean the police chief is. And there's a lot of sorts of different levels of that corruption that can undermine it. And so it really speaks to the fact that going after counter-narcotics policies in a difficult security environment is, it's kind of a crapshoot sometimes. So until the whole situation can be lifted up it's just the same thing with the roads. Unless you fix all aspects of the problem, fixing one is not going to be a sustainable solution. But the good news is that it does seem that people are willing to move away from the crops when they're actually able to.
I think we're coming to the end of the first panel. Before I close it, I'd like to see if any of the other panelists have any final words before we take a coffee break.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment on the very good issue of the problem of drugs, et cetera, in American cities, and that the problem, an aspect of the problem is the source. And so the source is there, and so we should go there and do something about that source. If you talk to Afghanistan officials or Mexican officials, what they would say is, this drug problem, it has a huge problem for our country, for Mexico, for Afghanistan. And the source of the problem is the demand. The demand is in the United States, and so if the demand wasn't there, the poppy wouldn't be here. And so to come and eradicate the poppy and do nothing about the demand seems, from their point of view, a little odd. And so their argument is, right or wrong, if it wasn't poppy in your cities, would it be something else? So another thought is, why is the demand there in the American cities, right? I mean, we could go and eradicate all the poppy in Afghanistan forever. Would that get rid of the demand in our cities? So it is a difficult problem. The question is certainly correct. What are we spending our money on, and where should it go? Right.
with that, I would like to thank the panelists for their contributions and the audience for your questions. As we move through the day, if you have follow-up comments or clarifications, we would very much welcome them, but please use the microphones, just in large part because we are archiving this and we are webcasting it. So thank you very much.